Welcome to BRG's ThinkSet podcast. I'm your host, Michael Whalen. BRG is a global consulting firm. We help organizations in disputes and investigations, corporate finance, and performance improvement and advisory. We're a multidisciplined group of experts, industry leaders, academics, data scientists, and professionals. Around the world, BRG delivers the inspired insights and practical strengths our clients need to stay ahead of what's next. For more information about BRG, please visit thinkbrg.com. We are recording this episode of the ThinkSet podcast close to the anniversary of an extraordinary event held in Edinburgh, Scotland, at Panmure House, Adam Smith's final residence. Adam Smith, of course, is called the father of capitalism and of modern economics, through his seminal works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and The Wealth of Nations. He was a key figure in the late 18th century's Scottish Enlightenment, the hallmarks of which were primacy of human reason, rejection of authority not governed by reason, empiricism, and practicality. Adam Smith's observations and conclusions provided a holistic theoretical underpinning of the Industrial Revolution and our modern economy. The conference was organized in part by David Teese, the chairman and principal executive officer of Berkeley Research Group. It was a call to action to thought leaders across disciplines, geographies, and perspectives at a time in which so many of Adam Smith's ideas seem under threat in the Western economies. Smith's paradigms also are directly challenged by the surge to prominence of a very different model pursued by China. David is with us now to discuss the new Enlightenment 1 year hence, and at a time in which the testing of Adam Smith's ideas may seem even more severe. So, David, welcome to ThinkSet Podcast.
I'm pleased to be here.
So, David, the New Enlightenment Conference closing plenary session seemed to end on a fairly positive note in 2019. The vast majority of the participants seemed to be fairly optimistic and sided with two outlooks that were outlined by you. The first was that the Western rules-based nations would be able to organically address their problems. And secondly, that China's expansion will be accommodated, if messily, within the global order. So do you think the consensus of the thought leaders you assembled would be any different if they were measured today?
Unfortunately, they would be a bit different. I think what's happened in the meantime is by no means at all clear that China can be accommodated in a rule of law type system. There were serious concerns about that, quite frankly, in Edinburgh. But what we've seen in the last year has, I think, led to a high degree of skepticism that China doesn't want to play by the rule of law, wants to play by the rule of rulers. And so we're going to have to create a whole new system of global governance, hopefully one that enables some amount of positive exchange between China and the rest of the world. It's critical that it does. But I think what is different is the United States and Europe and the rest of Asia kind of more or less seeing China the same way now. A year ago, that wasn't true. I think the U.S. was deeply concerned after a long time. 7 presidents were really supporting one after the other the idea of exchange and peaceful coexistence with China and rule of law governance. And I think there was a hope and expectation that China was moving to be part of that global system. But now the United States realizes that's not true. I think in the last 3 months, Europe, South Asia, and most of the rest of the world have actually come around closer to the U.S. perspective on China, which means there's still absolutely a need for working with China. But I think people are a bit more realistic about how we have to do that and how difficult that's going to be and how we need certain safeguards so that it can be done in a way that's mutually beneficial.
David, what do you see as the platform for this new means of engagement then with China?
Well, part of the problem is we haven't worked it out. In fact, one of the initiatives that I've been leading since our event in Edinburgh a year ago is to look at the global science and technology system. And really, whoever leads, whether it's the Western democracies or whether it's China, whoever leads in science and technology is going to end up essentially owning the global economic system and being the dominant global force. So what we need is some kind of new rules for coexistence. I actually use the term a new Bretton Woods for science and technology. So So that's what we have to work out with China. Not clear we can, but I think there's an emerging consensus in the Western nations that we've got to double down on science and technology, and we've got to figure out how to make the global system of innovation work for everybody, including the Western nations.
Well, that's interesting. And in your preparatory remarks for the new Enlightenment conference, if there was any element in perhaps which you faulted Adam Smith's foresight, you thought he understated the role of innovation in his formulations of wealth creation and productivity growth. But in these days, how has innovation succeeded or failed, particularly in the extraordinary circumstances that business leaders face in the current environment?
Well, that's a very good question. So let's think about the world 250 years ago of Adam Smith. It wasn't a global R&D system. Certainly, ideas traveled globally, somewhat slowly. Skills moved with the movement of people, but they didn't move on an internet because there wasn't one. Transportation was very slow, but there was a loosely connected global system of idea sharing and innovation, but it was certainly not central to Adam Smith's thesis. He was looking primarily at trade and goods, and to some extent trade and services, but almost entirely trade in physical goods and physical commodities, which was starting to, get underway at that time. So it was not surprising that he didn't focus as much as we need to focus today on innovation. Innovation was certainly part of his mindset. I mean, he talked about the invention of the plow. He talked about agricultural innovation. He knew innovation was important to the market system, but he didn't see, because it didn't exist until 200 plus years later, a system of global division of labor around science and technology and around innovation. He certainly had the story of the division of labor worked out, but I think he didn't necessarily see it as a global division of labor, which is what it is today. So that doesn't mean to say that Adam Smith is irrelevant, nor does it mean that he doesn't have anything to say about what this global system should look like. The principles that he espoused, which were ones of fair dealing, transparency, rule of law, engagement, and moral and ethically sound business dealings, I think all of that still stands. So we have the opportunity to employ his moral philosophy, his understanding of the importance of division of labor, to actually help us think through what a new global system of science and technology would look like. But there's a lot of details to be worked out and a lot of complex phenomena to be understood before we can really begin to shape that new policy environment. So we can certainly get a lift from Adam Smith, but there's a lot of work for us to do.
And you, of course, allude to the lesser known of Adam Smith's seminal works in the theory of moral sentiments. I mean, business leaders certainly feel they abide by, or at least operate in the free markets that were described in The Wealth of Nations. But what should they take away from Smith's work on the theory of moral sentiments? Have the shared norms of right and wrong been eroded to the extent that Smith's concept of an unwritten moral code to underpin productive economic and commercial activity, is that still viable for firm level leaders in today's environment?
Well, I believe it's necessary. I'm not sure if it's viable, but you make an extremely good point. Adam Smith is kind of better known for his second book, The Wealth of Nations, and for his first book, which was The Theory of the Moral Sentiments. But Adam Smith made it clear that you really needed these two books together to understand what a proper system of market exchange was all about. And in fact, for his own students, I believe he started them off on the theory of the moral sentiments, and then they might graduate to issues relating to the wealth of nations. And he is very clear that there's certain ethical norms which must be infused through a market economy for it to be successful. In fact, he had this concept of what he called the impartial spectator, that in making our business decisions, we should always assume there's somebody looking over our shoulder with a moral compass and with strong ethical norms that would tell us whether we're, check to see whether we're dealing with the other parties fairly. So I think there's a lot of relevance to what Adam Smith had to say in both books today. And I think, in the better business schools, we actually teach the theory of the moral sentiments and lay it alongside the wealth of nations and getting our students to understand that there has to be a strong ethical code associated with exchange and fair dealings. And that's often forgotten or it's often not practiced. And, I think we see some of the negative consequences of that and some of the trust in the market system gets undermined when people don't behave in proper and ethical fashion.
And of course, Adam Smith is often identified with a principle of laissez faire and the advancement of public interests through the application of self interest in free and competitive markets. But that really took a pretty big knock during the great financial crisis from 2008 to 2012. And in these current times, the idea that a firm's prime duty is to its providers of capital has certainly been under attack in the Anglosphere, not just from politicians, but also from academics, investment managers, corporate leaders, and I think, most of the presenters at the New Enlightenment conference.
Well, I think the fundamental problem is that the textbooks about half a dozen sentences from Adam Smith. And even my fellow brethren as economists, most of them have never read The Wealth of Nations, let alone the theory of the moral sentiments. So Adam Smith gets taken out of context and is often read as simply saying the pursuit of self interest is consistent with the pursuit of the common good. I think it's better to say that Adam Smith believed in a decentralized economic system, but he did not necessarily believe that pure selfishness was the compass that should guide everybody. In fact, he's very clear that every people in business as well as in society need a moral compass and have to deal fairly and properly with others. A lot of people have misunderstood the type of laissez-faire that Adam Smith was actually promoting. It wasn't a complete free-for-all at all. There was a role for the state, albeit a minimalist role. But more importantly, individual actors, business people, traders, needed to be infused with certain level of ethical responsibility to themselves and to others. Although he recognized that a sense of community wouldn't necessarily be global. He actually has a wonderful quote in there where he says, if there's some kind of disaster in China, a plague in China, are we going to care very much? And he kind of concludes that, well, probably not. So we have to care for our own, I suppose, first is really where Adam Smith was, but he was certainly not pushing a selfish agenda at all. In fact, the whole moral concept of the impartial spectator always required you in making decisions to think about what somebody else looking over your shoulder would say. And clearly, if it's just merely the pursuit of self interest, you don't need to have somebody looking over your shoulder. But the fact that there's somebody looking over your shoulder is, to me, underscores the fact that he always thought there was a greater level of responsibility than simply pursuing one's self interest.
In that environment where there is this ongoing discussion about the role of broader groups of stakeholders having a impact on the decisions made by corporate leaders, how do you sort out what potentially are conflicting demands from various stakeholders?
Yeah, well, a very, very good question. And this brings us right to the heart of the current debates about corporate governance and what should be the role of the corporation in modern society. And if you actually look at corporate law, there's a fairly broad mandate, and CEOs have a lot of flexibility with respect to how they run businesses and the longer term goals and the concern for the greater good. But what happened beginning sort of in the late 70s and 80s is a number of folks in the economics profession and in the finance profession kind of reinterpreted shareholder rights as being consistent with the greater good. And I actually think long term shareholder rights is something that indeed is a powerful tool that should animate business. But what happened is that, and this is unwittingly and unknowingly, we've built a system that doesn't favor long term shareholder rights. It favors short termism and it favors traders. If you focus on long term shareholder rights, then you've got to think about a broader set of constituencies. So There is an active movement, a multi-stakeholder view of the business enterprise, and John Kay, one of our speakers in Edinburgh, was one of the pioneers of that perspective. And I do believe that executives need to think of stakeholders beyond the shareholders, not just workers, not just other suppliers, but the community at large needs to be part of what corporate CEOs and boards are thinking about. But the way to get there, in my view, is to focus on the long term. And if you focus on long term stewardship for the shareholder, you inevitably end up recognizing that other elements of society are important for the long term stewardship of the business enterprise, and you get to a comfortable place. One of the problems with a multi stakeholder view is there's no compass, there's no limit to the diversity of things that managers and executives and boards should be doing. And I think we lose the very purpose of the corporation, and we lose focus. A corporation is not a social machine, it's an economic machine, but it has to be socially responsible. So there's a complicated set of issues there that we started dealing with at Edinburgh and we're still dealing with, and many of the people at Edinburgh are part of a movement to really get away from an exclusive focus on shareholder rights, because I think it has in fact had the unfortunate effect of causing companies to underinvest in the future. That means less jobs, that means less economic growth, it means less prosperity for society, all for the short term benefit of traders. So, this is one of the things that I think the good news is both, in the United States, both Republicans and Democrats are rethinking these issues as we speak. And worldwide, there's a recognition that the pursuit of shareholder rights got corrupted into something different and has had a negative effect on business in the West.
But is that a diminution of all shareholders' rights or just the right sort of shareholders in the eyes of the corporate managers?
Well, the right sort of shareholders is, in my view, the long term holders. In fact, a shareholder, I underscore the word holder, is somebody who actually keeps the stock for the longer term. If you actually look at the time period that people hold stocks, it's gone from years to months to days to minutes because of program trading and various other things. So a trader is not a shareholder, and in my view, shouldn't have a seat at the table. So the short term people who have masqueraded under the title of shareholders, in my view, they've had unfortunate side effects for society, and they've expropriated wealth that really they didn't earn in any fundamental sense, and that in turn has led to a loss of confidence in capitalism. The good news is these things are relatively easy to fix. I mean, one of the ways in which short termism has manifested itself is all of these share buybacks. And so we go into a pandemic where corporate balance sheets aren't what they could be or should be, in part because companies have aggressively been buying back their stock, which in some cases help the short term value of their shares, but it really then leads corporations to be more vulnerable. And government has to come in and bail them out, which is not right. When you have a combination of corporate bailouts and shareholder rights movement together, you end up with a redistribution of wealth that's unfortunate and leads to a general erosion of confidence in the system. The good news is I think these things are fixable. These are issues we started to discuss in Edinburgh. There's a lot of people in a lot of places who are looking at these issues, and I think there's an emerging consensus that the shareholder rights movement has not been beneficial as beneficial as many people thought it would, and we need to kind of find a different way to move forward that does take a broader group of constituencies into account and focuses on the longer term. And of course, the longer term will allow us to invest in science and technology and the other key things that are necessary to move society forward, whether it's solving questions of climate change or whether it's driving economic growth. These are existential issues. So what we're talking about here transcends anything else we could be talking about, in my view, in terms of the prosperity and survival of a free society.
So in Edinburgh last year, there was perhaps a foretaste of the degree of scrutiny to which historical figures such as Adam Smith are put under. And currently, in this environment, it's quite a substantial amount of scrutiny relative to memorials or remembrances of those figures. Perhaps less of a concern for Adam Smith than his statue would be his ideas. And we live in a world in which the popular right is now advocating mercantilist solutions, which very much prompted Adam Smith's economic theories. And we have the popular left proposing a deprioritization of market based outcomes. And then finally, you have generationally a number of young people in the workforce who, to a large extent, do not seem to subscribe to classically liberal concepts of reasoned debate, perhaps as the Scottish Enlightenment emphasized. So, how does the new Enlightenment deal with the apparent threat to so many of the principles of the historical
Well,
Enlightenment?
very good question. First of all, I'll begin by saying, as Neil Ferguson did in Edinburgh, actually, there weren't any monuments to Adam Smith until very recently. Edinburgh, only in the last, I think, 15 to 20 years, put up a statue for Adam Smith. So while other people are tearing down statues, Scots are putting them up. And the restoration of Panmure House is like a monument to Adam Smith. So in fact, some people in various parts of the world are recognizing the importance of Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment. And we now need a new Enlightenment. And you're right to observe that the world is hopefully temporarily becoming more mercantilist. I mean, we've had China being incredibly mercantilist and the Western world being basically open. And the response to that has been, oh, the oldest of human norms, so the anthropologists tell us, is reciprocity. So if China is going to be mercantilist, then we'll be mercantilist too. It's not to our mutual benefit, but it's one way to kind of deal with other mercantilist nations. So what's happened is there's been an erosion of the system because there's a new and powerful player operating by a new set of rules. And we're woken up to the fact that when you have two players, one with one set of rules, another with a different set of rules, it doesn't work. And so I think the world is going through a period of change. And what I hope will happen is that the Western nations and those that care about individual liberty, as Adam Smith did, we'll double down and create a new system of rules for ourselves. And there may have to be a different set of rules for dealing with autocratic nations that don't care about the rule of law and don't care about the same principles that made the world so prosperous particularly in the last 70 years. So I'm not all pessimistic about this. Actually, I'm much more optimistic today than I was in Edinburgh, in part because I see Europe and the United States, not in terms of daily political actions, but if you look at the intellectual thought in Europe and the United States amongst people that worry about these kinds of issues, there is, I think, an emerging consensus, or at least some convergence, and a realization that we have to create a new world order. There's no leadership to accomplish that yet, but even if there was leadership, I don't think we've got it figured out. So the Berkeley Research Group Institute is active on these issues. We continue to be supported by Lord David Sainsbury from the UK, and we're about to get some additional foundation grants. So while we're doing our everyday business of trying to assist clients, we're also working on these broader, deeper issues to make sure that 50 and 100 years from now, we have a prosperous and fair and equitable world order. And that's what the Panmure Declaration was all about. So I think it's good for everybody to understand that the Berkeley Research Group, while we are head down and tail up every day trying to get our work done, we are deeply engaged in these broader set of issues at a national and international level that will impact the future, not just of the Berkeley Research Group, but of all the communities and constituencies that we deal with.
David, I'd like to wrap up with a question on a topic obviously near and dear to your heart, and that's innovation. And in the context of your comments right now on the pace of globalization slowing, if not going in reverse or even disaggregating, how does the pace and impact of innovation change? Does it diminish, or does a pause in globalization potentially lead to different paths for innovation?
Well, a couple of comments here are relevant. One is that we have a global system of innovation, and in the future, we're going to still continue to need to have a global system of innovation. But as I said earlier on, it's going to have safeguards in it so that intellectual property is protected, and those that invest not just in R&D but in other aspects of innovation have some chance of recouping their investment and continuing to innovate. We've got a huge literature on how to drive innovation forward, how to make people and organizations more creative, more entrepreneurial, and more innovative. But we have to now couple that with, well, how do we actually figure out how to capture the benefits from innovation for the societies that are providing the investment that fuels innovation? So there's a new focus on capturing value. And innovation is going to be critical to just about everything that matters. It's going to be critical to climate change. It's going to be critical to human health, to public health. I mean, we're all sitting right now hoping for a vaccine for corona, and the science and technology establishment globally is working on that. Some cases collectively, in some cases separately. But there is enormous promise in what science and technology can deliver. But there's also significant risks in what you can do with science and technology today. And so it all comes back to global governance. We need systems of control is too strong a word, but systems of regulation, be they informal or formal, to make sure that the progress that flows from science and technology is properly harnessed, properly rewarded, and properly distributed.
Well, luckily for us, David, at least podcast recording is a socially distant activity. So perhaps you could tell us what the plans are for the New Enlightenment conference going forward.
Yes, well, Panmure House is becoming an icon. And we're hoping when the pandemic is behind us, perhaps a year from now, we can actually physically meet again. In the meantime, we're going to have an online discussion amongst some of the people that were at Panmure House last year. We're going to have not a debate, but a discussion about some of these issues that you've been putting on the table here today, Michael. And I'm pleased to say that I think there is progress. You don't pick it up in the everyday media, but I think, as I said earlier, that there is a deeper understanding of what we need to do to clean up the mess, so to speak, and to make the global system function in a way that is both positive in terms of being able to generate and support prosperity, and also have that delivered to the four corners of the country as well as the four corners of the globe.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for joining us today on ThinkSet Podcast.
My pleasure.
This ThinkSet Podcast is brought to you by BRG. You can subscribe to the podcast and access other content from ThinkSet Magazine by going to thinksetmag.com. Don't forget to rate and review the show on iTunes as well. I'm Michael Whalen. Thanks for listening. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of Berkeley Research Group or its other employees and affiliates.